Okay, well, welcome everybody. So glad that you could join us here today for today's workshop on creating accessible PowerPoint presentations. This workshop is part of our ongoing professional development series towards inclusive accessibility in libraries, expanding possibilities for all ages and abilities. Going forward, we'll use the acronym TIAL or TIAL as the shortened form of the series title for this uh, professional development series. My name is Matt Geeza, and I collaborate on TIAL along with my colleagues Ashley Sklar and Suzanne Kiss, who are here with me this morning. The three of us work in various roles and capacities within the Connecticut State Library's Division of Library Development. And you can learn more about TIAL on our LibGuide, and Suzanne will be posting that into the chat momentarily if she hasn't already. We're here today for the second session in a five-part series called Creating Accessible Digital Documents. This mini-series is meant to be an introduction to digital document accessibility. Hopefully at the end of each workshop, you'll have a sense of the key elements used to make various types of digital documents accessible. This mini-series will continue over the course of the next several months with workshops occurring every 2 weeks, and we'll share links to how you can register and view the upcoming programs in the series in the chat as well. Today, as I said, we're focusing on PowerPoint. But before we dive into today's topic, just a few housekeeping items. For the purposes of attendance, we ask that if needed, that you rename your Zoom tile using the name that you registered, used to register for the workshop. Zoom offers a live captioning feature, and that is enabled, so please feel free to use and adjust that as needed. We are recording today's program, and the recording and slides will be made available on our Accessible Digital Documents LibGuide, which Suzanne is going to share that link with you. And I also emailed the link out to all registrants earlier this morning, so you have that in an email as well. So throughout our time together, I'll pause periodically for questions. You're welcome to ask questions by unmuting yourself or by entering them into the meeting chat. Suzanne and Ashley are going to help me out by keeping an eye on that meeting chat, and so feel free to add your questions there. And then if you're welcome to also include any insights, comments, into the chat. It's helpful to have that feedback. Finally, we'll follow up with you after this session with a brief survey. So please take a moment to share your feedback with us using the survey link that we'll share with you. And that information is also very helpful and informs our work. So just one last sort of thing, just a little bit about me. I'll be serving as the presenter for the workshops in this mini series. And I serve as the director of the Connecticut Library for Accessible Books, also known as CT Lab. At CT Lab, we provide books in audio and braille formats to Connecticut residents who cannot use print materials. And our patrons include people who are blind, people who have low vision, people who have perceptual or reading disabilities, and individuals that have a physical disability that impacts their ability to use print materials. So our work at CT Lab is very much centered around accessibility and making sure that people can access not just the books, but all information and communications from our library. And that means I regularly create all types of accessible digital documents. But when I started in this role, I was not familiar with this process at all. It's something I've learned on the job over the last several years. It's become a passion of mine, and I'm excited to share information with you. So if, depending on where you are in this journey and learning about accessible materials, I hope you don't fear, because this is something that with just a little bit of time and effort, it's pretty easy to make these adjustments and be on your way to creating accessible documents. So I'm going to turn now to the slides, and just give me a moment. I'm going to share my screen. Okay, Can you confirm, Suzanne or Ashley? I see you nodding. You see. Okay, so on today's agenda is PowerPoint accessibility. So we're going to go over the different elements of PowerPoint accessibility, the things we need to keep in mind as we create PowerPoint slides and decks. And then I'm going to make sure that we leave some time with a sample slide deck that we can work on together and make some corrections so that you have not only in the first half, we're really just going to cover the overview of the elements so that I'll go through those relatively quickly. But then rest assured that we're going to spend some time looking at a slide deck that we can make some corrections and we'll look at each of these elements within PowerPoint together and make some corrections. So, just a quick overview about the benefits of accessibility. Um, when we're creating these kind of documents, we're especially doing so for folks who use screen readers. This is, if you're not familiar with this technology, screen readers are a type of software that can be used by somebody who's using computer, but also smartphones and tablets. So, for example, Apple devices have a built-in screen reader that's known as VoiceOver. It's there, it's free as part of the operating system, and it's something that any user can enable as when they're using their phone or a tablet. Um, so what the screen reader does is it reads out the content on the screen to the user. This is primarily used by folks who are blind, but also folks who have low vision, or also can be used by people who have a reading difference and are, both reading the screen, but also listening to the content being read out and help them with processing the information. It also is helpful. The things we're talking about can be helpful for people who are using keyboards as their primary method of navigation. This means they're not using a mouse, but instead using their keyboard to navigate through the digital content that they're interacting with. And of course, like a lot of things related to accessibility, many of the things that we're talking about are intended to improve the experience for a specific audience or group of people, but often we find that these benefits benefit everybody. These practices benefit everybody. And a great example that I often share is the example of captions, which were primarily created for people who are deaf and hard of hearing. But now we find that captions are used on televisions in all sorts of contexts. There's articles that I've been seeing lately where a large segment of the population who would be considered hearing are consuming almost all of their television or Netflix streaming services using captions. So it's widely used. That's an example of a service that though created for somebody or a group of people who were deaf and hard of hearing, it is widely used by all types of people. And in our context, when we're talking about accessible documents, today we're focusing on PowerPoint, but what we're talking about are Word documents, emails, PDFs, Excel spreadsheets as well. And we're utilizing fonts, colors, alternative text, and structure to improve the navigation and readability of the document. So that's what we're talking about when we say accessible documents. So for PowerPoint, there are a few key elements. There's about 10 of them. This list might seem like a long list. It might seem somewhat intimidating, but I promise you that I think you'll find as you start to incorporate this into your work that it just becomes very easily incorporated into your regular workflow. And after a time, you're not even having to think about these things. They're just integrated into your approach when you're creating a Word document, or in our case today, PowerPoint slides. So today, the elements that we're going to focus on are slide titles, fonts, um, talking about minimal use of text, use of color, both in color contrast and use of color to represent or symbolize meaning, alt text or alternative text for images. We'll talk about descriptive links, reading order, the built-in accessibility checker, and we'll talk about some tips for presenting. So when you've created your slideshow and you're presenting it, these tips are geared towards the actual delivery of that presentation. And as I said, we're going to first cover this in a slide deck with an introduction to each of these elements, and then we'll have a sample document where we'll really look at the use of each of these elements within PowerPoint. So slide titles, very simply, each slide needs to have its own unique title. The nice thing is that depending on the visual layout that you're going for, you can place the slide title on the slide, or it's possible to place the slide title in the margin. So it won't be seen by somebody who is viewing the slides, but because it is present in the margins, the coding is there, and it's the coding that screen readers use to read the content, not just what simply appears on the screen. So by placing it in the margin, it's still possible for the screen reader to access the slide title. And we want the slide titles to be unique because this is sort of the topic of each slide. And we want to make sure that somebody who is using a screen reader can understand the difference between the slide content from slide to slide. So I'll show you how to do this, but how do we place the slide title outside the slide margin? What you will do is in PowerPoint, go to the View option in the main top of your window and select Zoom. And then you can go to about a 50% ratio, and that will sort of expose the margins. And from that point, you can just take your cursor, click onto the slide title text box, and then drag and drop it up into the margin. So on the screenshot that I have placed here, we have an example of the slide, which is in white, and there's some text on the slide, but then the margins are represented by the grayed area that border the slide, and the slide title, in this case, known as slide titles, has been dragged into the margin. So that's a visual representation of how to do that. Fonts. Some of this, if you came to the Microsoft Word session, some of this you're going to find overlaps. So a lot of this work, the other nice thing about it is once you start doing this work, a lot of it, what we do in Microsoft Word also has applications in PowerPoint and vice versa and other types of documents. So do consider fonts, no matter whether you're working in Word or PowerPoint. And generally speaking, when we're talking about digital materials, fonts that are known as sans serif fonts are generally accepted as the easier to read font. Serifed fonts like Times New Roman have a sort of decorative element that some people will call them feet or tails, but they're embellishments that are often at the base of the letter, or in the case of a capital T, um, that crossbar at the top has these tails that hang down at each end in Times New Roman. Those are examples of what are known as serifs. Sans serif fonts, of course, means that they do not have those decorative elements or serifs. And so examples of the sans serif fonts, of course, are like Arial, Calibri. So at this point, I think Microsoft Word defaults to a sans serif font. So when if you're using Microsoft Office products, Office 365 products, it's pretty much always going to be a sans serif font as the default for you. In the context of PowerPoint, it's recommended that you use 18-point font or larger for your slide text. I would go even larger and say probably 24 is a good one for your body text and go larger from there. But generally avoid going any smaller than 18-point font for your slide text. And of course, this is probably minimizing text is probably something that we've heard at different points in the context of PowerPoint. We want to minimize the amount of slide content or text on the slide. Real, use speaker notes as somewhere you can place additional info. And speaker notes can actually be read by screen readers. So if you're exporting your and sharing your slide deck and you share the speaker notes, then somebody who's using a screen reader would be able to access those speaker notes when they're engaging with the content. And of course, you can supplement your content, your slides with accessible handouts. So, um, keep in mind, and in our case today, we did that. So I shared not only the slide deck, but I shared a tip sheet um, in an accessible PDF format that's available for download on our Creating Accessible Digital Documents LibGuide. So that's an example of how you could, use multiple types of, documents or materials in tandem with each other to share information with participants. I'll cover color contrast and then I'll pause for some questions. So if you've got some questions, some things you're thinking about, now might be a time to get them in the chat or just kind of get ready to unmute yourself. Um, but yeah, so give me a slide or two and then we'll break for a few questions. So color contrast. Color contrast is what we're talking about when we're talking about the contrast between the font color and its background. We didn't talk about this when we were talking about Word. I intentionally saved this for PowerPoint because we often, I think, encounter this more color contrast issues, I think tend to come up more in PowerPoint in the context of PowerPoint. But what we're aiming for is a minimum text to background ratio of 4.5 to 1. This is the standard that is set forth by the Web Content Access Group, also known as WCAG, and it's the level AA um, sort of a requirement for contrast. I've linked here and we'll, during our slide demo, we will visit the Web Aim contrast checker. So I'll show you how to use this when we go through our demonstration slides. But I want to highlight that this is a great resource for checking contrast. I find it very easy to use. It's something that I just have bookmarked in my web browser and can easily access it when I want to check contrast. Um, Also, related to color, we want to communicate information and data in color and text. I left out the and in this first bullet point. Um, don't use color as the only way to represent information. So I've got two examples of what I'm just talking about here. Example one, we have this is what you want to avoid this type of use of color. We just have a red circle and a green circle, but we don't know what those red circles and green circles mean. In this case, it's stop and go. Yes, that was what in example two, a good use of color in text is that we've simply placed the word stop inside the red circle and the word go inside the green circle. So we can tell not only sighted folks can tell the difference between the two circles, but anybody who's blind or colorblind would have a very difficult time discerning they would see if they can see the color, but they're colorblind, or excuse me, if they could see the circles, but they're colorblind, they would just see two different shades, but they wouldn't know what those shades meant. And I'll show you a tool that's in PowerPoint that kind of simulates color blindness, so you can kind of get a sense of what this might look like to somebody who wasn't able to differentiate those colors. So the bottom line here is, it's okay to use color, but just consider the contrast and then also consider how you're using the color. And if you're using the color to symbolize and convey meaning or information, also include some text. That way, no matter what, whether it's a screen reader user or somebody who has color blindness, that they are going to be able to interpret the information without difficulty. So I'll stop there and take a quick break and see if there are any questions. So feel free to unmute to ask your question or type them in the chat.
I'm not seeing any questions in the chat yet, but I'll keep my eyes out there. But again, you're also welcome to unmute and ask your question aloud as well.
Sure. I'll give it a few more seconds just to give folks time to type or bring up their question if they want to unmute. Okay, well, there's going to be more opportunities to ask questions, so we'll carry on, and please let me know if you have questions as we go along further. Alt text is something that we talked about in our first session with Microsoft Word. Alt text is short for alternative text, and it is what we're applying to images that we want to make sure a screen reader user would have some sort of description or image description when they encounter the image. What will happen when a screen reader encounters an image is that if there is no alternative text, it will announce image, and then usually it's going to announce the file name. And, in most cases, the file name is not helpful at all. Sometimes, depending on naming conventions, it might just be a random letter and number sequence that really has no meaning at all for somebody that would be encountering this with a screen reader. So if the image is important for our content, we want to then add alternative text. The other option would be if it's not important, we could mark the image as decorative. And if we mark the image as decorative, it's just the screen reader will just skip the image altogether. So it won't even announce image and um, it'll just skip it and it'll be as if that image did not exist. So let's talk a little bit more about that. So, for example, on this slide, I have in the top right corner of the slide part of the Connecticut State Library's logo, which is a multicolored, um, they almost look like flower petals, or I think it also could be used to represent the pages of a book when the book is opened with its spine flat on a surface, and so the pages are fanning out. Um, this image is marked as decorative. It appears on every single slide in this deck, and it's been marked as decorative because it's not conveying any image. It's nice. It adds a little something, visual element to the presentation, but it's not necessary to know about it in the understanding our topic, which is PowerPoint accessibility. So I've marked them as decorative. However, the screenshot that is on this slide is a screenshot of the alt text window that will come up when you're in Word or PowerPoint and you right click on an image. So it has the heading of alt text and then it poses the question, how would you describe this object and its context to somebody who is blind or low vision? And then it tells you to consider the subject or subjects in detail, the setting, the actions or interactions, and other relevant information. For the most part, alt text should be brief, 1 to 2 sentences. There are contexts where it might be helpful to have additional information. This is where it's more of an art than a science. There aren't necessarily hard and fast rules. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in the example that we have. But below that window or the field where you could enter your alt text is a checkbox that says approve alt text. So this is if you're going to use the Microsoft AI generated alt text description. And we'll talk more about that in a second. And below that is a checkbox marked as decorative. So if the image is going to be marked as decorative, you would still select the image, right click it, and then check that box mark as decorative. Here's an example of why we want to beware of AI generated alt text. And here I'm really talking about the Microsoft AI generator for alt text. It came up for the image that is on the screen. It's a digital talking book machine that is got a black or bluish black case with multicolored buttons, and sitting alongside of it is a talking book cartridge. The cartridge is sitting inside of a hard plastic mailing container, and that mailing container is open, and it opens like a clamshell. So I just gave you a quick image description by speaking. Um, but when AI generated that alt text for the this image, it said a black and blue electronic device. Um, yeah, sort of, but not really. So I think it would be helpful if we were going to include this image to have a slightly more precise image description. So I provided an example of alt text, a digital talking book player and a talking book cartridge. So if we were going to use one sentence to as our alt text, we could just stop there. But if we wanted to have a little different additional information, we could go on to the next sentence that says the cartridge sits inside a blue plastic mailing container. The mailing container's lid is flipped up to expose the cartridge. So sentences 2 and 3 are optional, but depending on the context that we were using this image, it may be helpful to have that additional information. And so this gives you an example of how, you know, your first sentence is, if you're only going to use one sentence, that's going to be your most important sentence for your alt text. And from there, the image description can build upon that first sentence. And in the example I'm giving here, sentence is essential, but second and third sentences in this alt text description, they're optional but helpful. So to wrap it up with alt text, really the purpose or the context in which you're using the image is the most important thing to consider. So you can ask yourself, is this image essential to the document and understanding the information here in the document? And if your answer is yes, then you will most likely use alt text. If it's not essential or the information is conveyed elsewhere within the slide text, you can then mark it as decorative because your user, your reader, is still going to get the information they need because it's somewhere on the slide. Uh, I've included a few alt text resources. So WebAIM and WCAG, which I mentioned is the Web Content Access Group, they are great resources for all things related to alternative text as well as image descriptions. I do want to call out the third bullet point, which is the alt text decision tree from WCAG. This is a great decision tree that kind of starts with the one question, and depending on whether you answer yes or no to that question, you then kind of follow that tree or flow chart through and get the arrive at the decision you need to create the proper image description for that type of image. Um, this is a topic that I think I've mentioned before. We could dedicate a whole workshop just to image description, but hopefully this is enough to at least give you a little bit of foundational understanding, and you have some resources that you can refer back to at a future time. Descriptive links, if you're including links within your slide deck, you want to use descriptive links, and I've been doing that throughout the slide deck. That I've been presenting this morning. So an example of what I'm talking about is at the bottom of this slide, we have the sentence, learn more about editing links in Word from WebAIM. And the phrase editing links in Word is hyperlinked. So rather than displaying the full URL on the slide, I have taken a phrase in that sentence and that relates to what the link is about or where the link is going to take me. And I've then hyperlinked that phrase. So this is what we're talking about when we say use descriptive links. In order to do that, you would just select the text, right click the text that you want to hyperlink, and then in insert link, you'll just paste the URL. The one time when it would be okay to to include the full URL is if you were distributing your slide deck as a hard copy paper handout and you wanted people to be able to have the URL to be able to look up the resource, then that would be an example of why and when you would want to have the full URL for print materials so that somebody can type that and copy that URL manually into their browser to access it. But if it's being distributed digitally and email or download from a website, that type of thing, you would want to use descriptive links. Reading order is something unique that pertains only to PowerPoint. And this is putting all of the objects that are on each slide in the logical reading order. So generally, this is not an issue if you follow and use, the template slides that are available in Microsoft Word. Or sorry, Microsoft PowerPoint, if you're following those sort of template slides, they're going to make sure that it's, labeled properly as a slide title and then, slide body, and it's going to preserve that proper reading order. So it'll read the slide title first and then the bulleted content or, whatever the content is that's on the screen. But if you've started to add different elements and you're customizing the slide a little bit more beyond what's available in the template, then chances are you're going to want to review the reading order and check it to make sure that the content is going to be read in the order that you would want it to be read. We'll look at an example of how to access this, but to do so, you would go to Review at the top of PowerPoint, choose the accessibility checker, and then open the reading order pane. And once you're in the reading order pane, you're able to select items and you can either manually drag them up or down, or I'll demonstrate this. There are arrows at the top of the reading order pane that allow you, once you've selected an item, to click the up arrow or down arrow to reorder the content into the order that it needs to be. So that is something to be on the lookout for. It is something that the accessibility checker, which brings us to that, will catch. So this is nice, is that and here's a typo that I spotted. Word's accessibility checker, Word, PowerPoint, they have a built-in accessibility checker. So does Excel. The way you access them is the same: review, check accessibility. And this is something you can enable to run while you are working. The thing to note about the accessibility checker is that it is going to catch some of what the elements that we've discussed so far, but not all of them. So it's a starting point for reviewing and correcting any accessibility related issues, but it is not necessarily going to catch everything. For example, font size is not something that it will typically catch, but it will catch reading order. It is starting to look at color and use of color and bring your attention to that. It will catch if there are missing slide titles. So those are a few examples of what it will catch and what it won't catch. The best thing to do is kind of have your little checklist, maybe the tip sheet that we're sharing with you, have that open, check that, and review all of the elements on the tip sheet or the slide deck, and then also use the accessibility checker, and that combination should help you produce an accessible slide deck. All right. Any questions from the group about the elements? Now I'm going to turn to, okay, you've created a slide deck. What are the tips for presenting? Before I jump into that, I'll be happy to answer questions.
I'm not seeing any questions in the chat at the moment. Or I shouldn't say that. There was one, but Suzanne answered it. Someone was asking about website accessibility. So Suzanne dropped a resource to a previous set of series. So we have a lot of resources on web accessibility that you can take a look at. Suzanne shared that in the chat, but no questions for this at the moment.
Great. Thank you for answering that, Suzanne. And yes, web accessibility is this whole related topic, but not something we're covering with this particular series. We're really kind of focusing primarily on the Office 365 resources with this series. But yes, there are some great resources that I'm sure Suzanne linked to. Um, and we'll also, I'll say, just on the topic of web accessibility, we'll be offering more sessions on that topic in the coming months. So stay tuned for more information. Oh, all right. Still no questions, right, Ashley? Okay. So I'll cover these pretty quickly. They may be something you've encountered before, but some tips for when you are the presenter. So if you've created your slide deck, you know you've got an accessible slide deck, there's some things you can do to make sure that your actual presentation is as accessible as possible. So one of them is to send slides and handouts prior to the presentation. This allows folks a little time to review the materials, and it can be helpful in generating questions. And it can be particularly helpful for folks who are blind or have low vision because it gives them a chance to interact with the information ahead of time. Um, and also folks who might have, you know, who might be working in English as their second language. It can be helpful to have materials ahead of time so that they can review them. Anybody that has difficulty processing information, that can also be helpful to have materials ahead of time. So that's the why behind this recommendation. If possible, use headphones and microphone. This just improves the sound quality for those that are listening. It also the combination of headphones and microphone avoids feedback and things like that. So it's another uh, minor thing that goes a long way for um, the audio experience. Um, Enable captions. You can do this using both Zoom and Teams, depending on the platform you're using. Um, in person, it is possible to use PowerPoint captions, and I will demonstrate how to use this. But under the slideshow menu, you can check a box that says "Always use subtitles." The caveat here is that you do need to have an internet connection, so wired or wireless Wi-Fi is fine. But in order for that built-in PowerPoint captions feature to work, you need to have an internet connection. But I've used it personally when presenting at conferences, and I know our colleague Kim, she's the one that actually tipped all of us off about this particular feature a while back. And so it's a handy one that if the in-person place that you are presenting does not have the ability to provide captions, you can do so using PowerPoint. Another few tips, so you could please repeat questions verbally, and then let me back up. Repeat questions that were asked verbally or typed into the chat. So no matter whether somebody unmuted themselves or if it's in person, make sure you repeat it for the all the audience members to hear the question. Allow processing time for questions. So I've been trying to do that and model that behavior here, where I ask a question or pause for questions, and don't immediately just move on because we're giving some time for folks to process what's been shared. When you can, use plain language. This is just good approach to use in any setting. Um, you should define jargon or acronyms or technical terms to the best you can. That way, your audience understands what you're referring to. And then the final slide related to presenting, cover all of the text on the slide. You don't have to do it exactly verbatim as it's written, but you should, at least kind of paraphrase and cover the content. Don't omit the material that is on the slide. This is especially important for folks who aren't able to visually see that information on the slide. So you want to make sure that everybody, whether it's virtual or in person, has access to that information. And then describe images that are on the slides and their relationship to the content. So it doesn't have to be an in-depth explanation of the image. It can be pretty brief. But again, this is something that I tried to model for you here this morning. When I had screenshots, I was describing what was in that particular image and what that screenshot was, because it was helpful to understand what the alt text window looks like in the context of that alt text discussion. And you can apply alt text descriptions to your verbal explanations. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing this slide deck and switch over to um, yep, there we go, some sample slides. So, sorry. Okay, so Um, here we are. I'm not going to go into present mode because we're now approaching this as if we're building the slideshow and doing the work. So I've got 6 slides. So we'll click through some of these 6 slides and um, address the different elements that we were talking about in the other slide deck. Um, so just real quick, one of the things that if you've got the accessibility checker set up to be working in the background, you'll notice in the bottom left corner of the screen, it says accessibility colon investigate. So this is my flag that I've got some issues that need to be remedied with this particular slide deck. So I can get to the accessibility checker in a few different ways. One is I can click on this phrase, accessibility investigate. And when I do that, it opens up the accessibility assistant and checker. And then it gives me you can choose to show only the issues on the current slide, or you can view all of the issues for the entire slide deck. That's up to you. But here, with the headers that are in this window, we get a sense of the different things that need to be addressed. So it's looking at color and contrast. Right now, it's not suggesting there's any problems with this slide. It is flagging that there is a missing alt text, and there's some issues related to document structure. Um, so it is possible to click on any one of these, and so I clicked on missing alt text, and then it took me to the area that I needed to investigate. I'm going to close the accessibility assistant for a moment and show you the other way that you can access the accessibility assistant. And that's through the top menu by going to review, check accessibility, and then when I mouse over, there's a few options. There's check accessibility, alt text, reading order pane, and options accessibility. So options accessibility is where we can customize our preferences related to the accessibility checker. So got some, I've opened that window and it's now showing that I have 2 things checked. Show accessibility status for the accessibility assistant in the status bar. That's what we are seeing in the bottom left of the screen. And then show accessibility status for each slide. What that is referring to is alongside each slide that there's a problem, there's the accessibility symbol with the human figure with sort of outstretched arms and legs. Anytime that figure appears alongside a slide or even a Microsoft Word alongside your text, that is the accessibility status for that particular slide and telling you there's something needs to be addressed. So that's how you can do that. This accessibility window is also how we can get to the reading order pane, which we'll come back to in a moment, and also for alt text. So The two ways you can get it are to the accessibility checker are through the review, check accessibility, or by going to the bottom left corner and clicking accessibility investigate. Um, so for this particular, I'm going to zoom out just a little bit. I'm on the first slide that there's a problem, and one of them is that I know there probably isn't alt text. So my image that's in the top right corner here, I'll right click on that, and then from this menu, select View Alt Text. So indeed, there is no alt text for this. So I could now click into that text box and enter the text, or as we discussed earlier, this is something that I think is just going to be marked as decorative. So I'll check the mark as decorative. And this little colored bar looks like that was already marked as decorative, but that's just another example through experience. I'm looking for all of the sort of graphical or visual elements that I might need to address with alt text, whether I'm adding alt text or marking as decorative. You notice when we added alt text, um, the little accessibility icon that was appearing next to slide 3 went away. So this slide is now okay. There's no issues with that particular slide. I will show you how, if we zoom out I can just go to even like 70%. We talked about how you could place the slide title in the margin. So what I've done is I've zoomed out and now we can see we've got our slide that is the rectangle, that's the white slide. And then there's the gray border that represents the margins all around that slide. So now I've selected the slide title text box, and with my crosshairs, the four arrows, I can just drag this right off of the slide up into the margin. So as we talked about, this is still readable by a screen reader, but when we go into present mode, if I were to view that slide, notice it doesn't show visually. Um, Here's another problem. Even though, and this is a great example of what the accessibility checker will and will not catch. Um, Anybody noticing any problem with our body text here? And I don't have the chat open, so Ashley or Suzanne,
Oh,
if you could just, yeah,
sure.
if
Someone is
just,
noting that it's very small. It's tiny. Yes.
yes,
I
yeah,
can't read it.
yeah, yeah. So if I go to home, okay, so this is 14 point font right here. So it, as we talked about in when discussing fonts, we need to make it at least 18. So that's 18 point font. Like I said, that seems a little small. I'm going to go up to 24. Um, and if I zoom back out to 100% or a little larger, we can see that this is a better size, I think. Anybody else notice anything about the font? I'm not sure if it came up in the chat. So if I select the font here and
Yeah,
click into it,
multiple people are saying it is not a
good.
sans serif or it's a serif font.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, so it was Times New Roman. So I'll just go ahead, come up to font, and I'll choose Arial. And now we have a sans serif font for that particular slide. So again, accessibility checker didn't catch the font or the whether it was sans serifed or the size. So that's something we need to especially be on the lookout for. Um, okay, so on this particular slide, um, we again are missing alt text. So the alt text window is already open on the right side when I clicked onto that image. So I will do a quick image description into the alt text box. Um, so the alt text that I've entered quickly is screenshot of PowerPoint slide under construction and demonstrating placement of slide title in the margin. Um, so once I've done that, I've got alt text, and I think there's still an issue with this slide. Okay, so there's a duplicate slide title. So it did catch the fact that um, this slide title here, when I go back out to, so slide 3 is titled slide titles. Slide 4 is also titled slide titles. So this is a great example of how Accessibility Checker will catch this. I can since this is about the same topic, for example, I could just enter comma true to say it's the second slide on this topic, and that'll be sufficient enough to differentiate slide 3 from slide 4 in terms of slide titles. So if you're duplicating slides, as you add slides into your PowerPoint, often a lot of times I'm working where I'll, right click on the slide, duplicate a slide, and when I duplicate it, instantly it's coming, all that information is coming in. So I have to quickly change the slide title. And of course, I'll change the content, but it's flagging the in the accessibility checker the the slide title. So once I've changed that to slide title 3, that's better. I'm going to move on to slide 6 now. We do need a slide title, so I could say something like, and I'll enter that slide title. And here is a great example of where we can get to um, web aim. So this is web aim, and we have our a box on the left that says foreground value. So this would be the text itself, and then our background value. Um, so if I was using this in, sorry, tandem with and checking, for example, this blue text, one of the things I can do is come up to foreground, and when I click into color picker, there's this medicine dropper. And if I select the medicine dropper, I can then, uh, what I'm illustrating is that dropper gives me a magnifying window, and I can select my color of my text. And when I click on it, it then automatically detects the foreground color. So I'll expand this. Now, once I've made that selection, my background color is white, so that's good. So it's telling us our contrast ratio is 5.91 to 1. So here below, it gives us a little bit more information. So for normal text, this would pass the WCAG level 2, um, level AA, and for large text as well. So this is an example of a good contrast ratio. Remember, it's got to be a minimum of 4.5 to 1. Uh, so that's one way to check our color contrast. And the other thing that's needs to be corrected on this slide is I'm just going to copy this link. And I'm going to make it into a uh, a link that is a descriptive link. So I'm highlighting the text web aim contrast checker. I'm right clicking on that phrase, and then from that menu choosing link. Here it opens another window, and in the address bar, I'll just paste the URL. Up above, it tells us text to display. If I wanted to change the descriptive link text, I could do that here in this window or on the slide itself. When I click OK, we now have a hyperlinked uh, contrast checker link that is descriptive. So I've been covering a couple things and I haven't really paused for questions. So based on the demonstration, as we've been correcting some of these issues related to the slides, are there any questions from the group?
Hey, Matt, we do have a question. I'm just going to read it. Do screen readers care about slash note the capitalization? For example, quote, if I type like this, that is written in all capital letters. Will it be louder or say something like in capitals?
It typically doesn't pick up on, the all capitalization. There, but I will say though, screen readers users have some control over what's called the verbosity, and that's how much information is shared. So if you have the verbosity sort of fully enabled, it is going to pick up on things like punctuation, um, or for example, square brackets. So if I put a phrase inside square brackets, when it comes to the first square bracket, it'll say bracket and then read the text inside the bracket and then tell me bracket again for the closing of the bracket. It does the same thing with parentheses. So it will pick up on those kind of things. It will also, in the context of, if you've heard of camel case, which here's a great example, web aim, right? The capital W, lowercase e, lowercase b, capital A, lowercase I, lowercase m. Um, it is more a screen reader is more likely to read that correctly as web aim and pronounce it how we would pronounce it if the W and the A, when words are combined, are capitalized. We talk about camel case, especially when using hashtags on social media. So if you're using a phrase, every word should have a capital, start with the capital letter. It's therefore easier for the screen readers to parse that information and to distinguish the different words that make up that string. So that's a little bit of a tangent, but kind of related to what the question was asking.
And they thank you for that.
Great.
I don't have any other questions at the moment. Somebody did ask about recordings of these, and Suzanne did drop the link to the LibGuide where the recordings for all of the sessions that are part of this accessible digital documents series will live. So you can find those there along with the slides and the tip sheets that Matt has mentioned. So that link is in the chat for everyone. But if you do have questions, now is your chance. Again, you can use the chat or you can come off mute and talk to us. Oh,
Yeah.
here we
And while
go.
you're,
Yeah, we have a question.
oh, great. Yeah.
Um, so question on moving slide titles to the margin. When you do this, people watching your presentation will see a slide without any kind of title. Your example makes the slide look so blank. Just trying to understand whether to use this feature or not.
Yeah, so there might be, I share that with you just to show you that there are contexts when you're designing a slide where perhaps like visually you don't feel as though you need to have the slide title there. Um, and I'm failing to come up with a great example right now off the top of my head. Um, but there might be contexts or scenarios where that could be helpful. And I just wanted to at least share with you that it's possible that if visually you want to make the choice to not you have your slide titles display, it is still embedding or that information into the coding of your presentation so that anybody that's reading the the presentation using a screen reader, they're going to get the titles they need in order to differentiate the different topics in your slides.
Someone pointed out that this might be useful for slides where you are just showing pictures, which was my sort of one example I could
Right.
see. If you had a slide that was just a giant picture, you might not want text over that image. So you might move the slide title off the image, but then of course you would use alt text, right? If that was an image
Yes.
that was really key to conveying the content of the presentation. So that would be an opportunity to use that, but take advantage of that feature to move the slide title. And
Yeah, that's a
thank
great
you.
example. Yeah, thank you. And here's another, like, kind of building on that, as that kind of got my brain moving again. For example, like if I had a chart or a graph that was the only item on your slide, and that chart and graph had a built-in title. So you would be like, oh, well, I've already got a chart title that's been incorporated as part of the graphic, and then it feels a little redundant to also have a slide title. That might be an example where, again, because it's a chart and graph and it's information, it's the only information as that's appearing on that slide, you want to include alt text to give some additional context about that information. But it might be an example of where you would drag the slide title off into the margin.
I like that example too, Matt, because that makes me also think about you would then have the ability to make that chart or graph even bigger on the slide, right? If you didn't have that slide title taking up that space.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Um, the last slide that I have an example of is the use of color, and we're using color in a few different ways on this particular slide. And I know it's just a few minutes past 11, so I'll try to be quick with this, but I do want to cover this in this illustration. So interestingly enough, the accessibility checker, when it flags this, it asks us to check the reading order. It doesn't say anything about a dark gray slide with some black text or anything about these red circles and green circles that relate to order status. Um, so this is an example where, um, accessibility checker maybe falls a little short and isn't catching everything. Um, so is this slide background with the black text, this dark gray slide background with black text, does it meet the color contrast? Yes, it does, but it's really close. I checked it. I think it's just over 4.5. I think it might be hard for a lot of people to differentiate. So my recommendation would be, like the rest of the slide deck, we would probably just do black text with a white background. So that's one thing that I wanted to show, that like this is kind of just into the margins where it passes the color contrast ratio, but barely. The other thing that's happening with color is that we've got order status, and poor Matt and Kim have red circles, and Suzanne and Ashley have green circles, but we don't know really what those circles mean related to the order status. So ideally, what we would do is either use just text to convey what the order status was, or add a text box, on top of the circle that says, incomplete for a red circle, complete for green circle, that type of thing. So we know that anybody that is trying to distinguish between the colors doesn't have to rely solely on the color. And to further illustrate that, here under accessibility, if I click this inspect without color, here's how those red and green circles appear in a sort of a gray scale in format. And so it's very difficult to tell. We just see the shading. We don't really have any sense of what the color is. So if somebody that is experiencing color blindness, especially when it comes to red and green, this would be hard for them to interpret, what do these circles mean? And the other thing that the accessibility checker flagged was the reading order. So because it's flagged it, we can click under the accessibility assistant pane. We could click check reading order, or we could go to accessibility or review, check accessibility reading order pane. So either way, I'm now in the reading order pane. And earlier I described how we could either drag or drop. So just like that. Or we could use the arrow buttons. So my content placeholder 2 is what's selected. And so as I place arrow up, you can see it marches up in the reading order back up to its original position of 2. Now, that corresponds with this text box here on the slide that is now highlighted. Notice that if the picture was decorative, it is not checked. And so this tells us that it's going to be skipped by the um, any screen reader. But I think the reading order is um, actually no. It we would want to say red circle before Matt, and we would want to say green circle before Suzanne. And I think our names are out of order in the way that they appear actually on the slide. So there would be some rearranging that we would have to do. I'm not going to have everybody through all of that, but you can see I'm either dragging or dropping or using the up and down buttons within the reading order pane to to do the reordering. If the accessibility assistant is smart enough to understand uh, the flow, it should be. So eventually it should resolve itself once you've got the reading order correct. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and see if there are any final questions or comments before we wrap up.
We have no other questions in the chat that weren't already addressed. I should say someone asked about the inspect without color just before you then went and discussed that feature. So if you do have a question, we can pause here and give you a moment to type it in the chat, or you can come off mute. Um, Otherwise, we can conclude.
Yeah, I'll give it just a moment or two for folks. I am actually going to bring my,
You're getting some thanks, Matt, in the chat.
great. So I just wanted to make sure that folks had my email address. Of course, is that
No,
slide showing?
we're seeing just your desktop.
Oh, let me correct that. All right. Did want people to have my email address. Of course, this is in the slide deck. So if you download the slides, you have my email address. I'm here to answer your questions that arise in the future. This is so don't feel like you just heard this session and that needs to be the end of our interaction. I'm happy to support you and your team at your library if this is an area of focus for you and your colleagues. So I'm happy to answer questions you might have as you start doing this work. And a quick reminder too that the next session is going to be March 5th, and we're going to focus on Excel, creating accessible Excel spreadsheets. March 19th, we'll cover PDFs, and April 2nd, we're going to do office hours. Um, so with that, I'm sorry I went a little long, but I appreciate everybody sticking with it. And thanks for coming today. Very happy to have you join us and hope we'll see you in a few weeks.